Hello folks, this is Pierre-André Mathieu, and I'm here today with the latest tutorial in not only improving the damage system for both players and enemies, but also implementing the damage system for the melee weapon currently equipped to the player character. Now before I begin this video, I would like to share with you a program I use on my personal projects. This program is called Melee Trace, a plugin created by Robert Luiki. It is a very good tool to use, especially if you want the trace to always hit no matter what. It's free. You can buy it on Fab Marketplace. With that out of the way, let's get started. Now, if I play here, I'll see if my weapon hits the enemy. As you can see, my weapon is not hitting the enemy. That's because I need something that can hit the enemy. And as I said in my intro, I have a perfect plugin for this sort of thing. Now let's open third-person blueprints. And going to character, I'm gonna open character template, and I'll open character blueprint. With the character blueprint open, I'm going to add melee trace. If you don't, okay. If you're trying to add a component and if you're looking for melee trace and somehow it's not there, what I would do is go to plugins and search for melee trace. That's if you buy it from Fab Marketplace. After I type melee trace, and when I see it, what I do is place a check mark to true, and after placing the check mark to true, the tab on the bottom right said if you want to restart the whole thing. And once you see it, quickly click yes to restart the whole thing. Now know that it may take a few minutes or so to fully restart the whole thing. After that, you can continue the rest of the whole thing with your new plugin fully installed. With the plugin installed, as I said, all I have to do is add a new component and find melee trace and click it. Now that I have my melee trace, what I'm going to do is click on the variable name and rename it to character melee trace, because the character blueprint is the source of both player and enemy blueprint. So it's only natural that I can use the character melee trace within either player blueprint or enemy blueprint. Before I go on to the weapons, I'm gonna have to improve the damage system for both player and enemy. So to do this, I'll need to go to master melee weapon, search for that. Yeah, I know, I could have gone to data table, but either way, what I'm going to do is go to data table, melee weapon data table, and remove the check mark on is melee weapon visible. What I'm doing here is to improve the damage system for unarmed combat, both player and enemy blueprint. So I'm gonna open character folder, template. I'm gonna open the player character. I'm gonna find an open space for me to work my magic. So in selecting character melee trace, what I'm going to do is add on trace hit. The hit actor should be enemy blueprint. Once I have that, I'm going to extract a node from as enemy blueprint and type in contains. From the array, I'm going to extract this and rename it hit enemy AI array. Again, I'm going to extract a node from as enemy AI blueprint and type in is invincible, or yeah, that's the one. From is invincible, I'm going to use an or boolean bring out a branch. What I'm doing is I need to determine if the enemy is invincible or if the array contains hit enemies. So just so that I don't waste any further time, I'm gonna go to character blueprint, double click collision tick, and then what I'm going to do is copy from these nodes and paste it right here. And since I'm going to use false from the branch that determines whether the enemy is invincible or contains a certain amount of hit enemy arrays, I'm going to connect this link to here. Gonna organize it. I'm not going to be needing that. What I need is to get standard charge level. This one, I'm gonna do the same thing. Erase that. Okay. I add that in, but the real problem is it has no hit results. Well, I don't think that's too much of a problem because I can extract hit location, normal, and bow name to what I'm about to extract from the hit result, which is make hit result. And because of that, I'm going to extract a node from hit location of on trace hit to location. I'm going to do the same thing with hit normal. And hit bow name. For this one, I'll use hit location. Rotation, I'll use hit normal. I'll use enemy AI. After that, I'll highlight this. Rename it player melee trace. Before I test it out to see if this new melee trace works, I'm going to go back to character blueprint and delete the collision tick, because adjusting the draw time can be a pain in the neck. So yeah, I no longer have any uses for it. But in doing so, it's going to cause a severe problem to the hitbox, but that's really not that much of a problem. Well, not to me. So I'm going to delete that. Delete this too. These should be deleted. The only thing I need is the hit data. Now the next thing I'm going to do is click File, click Repair and Blueprint, and that the blueprint that I needed from is the melee trace. Because melee trace provides me with everything I needed to place a trace mark for whenever the player or enemy attacks one another. Going to notify end. I'm going to extract a node from as character blueprint and type in character melee trace. After that, I'm going to use force and all traces. Because whenever the collision ended, it randomly activates the melee trace even when I'm not attacking. So it only makes sense for me to use this to enforce in every single trace, whether unarmed or melee weapon. Another thing I'm going to add, especially within the character blueprint, whenever the enemy dies, whenever the player or enemy dies, either player or enemy should not be able to activate the melee trace. So I'm going to use force and all traces to do the same thing with the death animation. Oops, wrong one. Silly me. Oh. Nope. Wrong again. There it is. Now, to add this. There we go. Now that I added a new melee trace, I'm going to go to player character, which is the ninja character. I'm going to type attack. What I'm going to do is make new adjustments to the set hitbox, which is the one I've made modifications to. I'm going to click on my first attack combo. Using this skeleton tree as a reference, what I'm going to do is set the melee trace info based on that skeleton tree. Okay, the first thing I should do is draw the debug, then implement the trace based on that skeleton tree, which I'm seeing right now. As you can see, that red line is the melee trace. Align one. Well, correction. Line melee trace. So, what I'm going to do is switch from line to sphere shape, because in my personal opinion, unarmed melee attacks are used with the sphere melee trace shape. All I need to do is to increase the radius to, say, 45. Or rather 30. You can set it big or small. That choice is up to you. To make things easier, I'm going to copy this and move on to the next animation. I'm going to change from right to left. save all of them. Now let's test what I have here so far. Yeah, it may slow down at first. It looks like I made a mistake on my part. What I need to do is set a hit actor. Though I'm not sure if that's the case, but I'll see. Nope, it's still doing the same thing. Wonder why. Oh yeah. What I need to do is extract a node from as enemy AI blueprint and place it onto get hit BI character. The real question is, will this work? Only one way to find out. Survey says, yes, it does work. And quite nicely, too. So yeah, this is the part where I set up the melee trace for the player. Let's add something a little extra to it. From the false of the branch, I'm going to add unique. Then extract a node from enemy blueprint to add unique. Then use enemy AI hit array for add unique. Let's see if this works. Gonna try again. The reason it's not hitting is because I need something to clear the hit array. So going to character melee trace, I'm going to add on trace start. I'm gonna determine if it is valid. Then use a clear array and use hit enemy AI array to clear the whole thing so that I can attack the enemy as much as I want. I'm not sure if it works, but I'll see. Well. Turns out it does work. Going to highlight this and rename it Start Player Melee Trace. Oopsie. There we go. And one more thing. I'm gonna add something to the end trace part. Of course, this is optional. You can follow along if you want. I mean, I won't stop you. But if you want to add something extra to it, this is what I'm showing you. I'll use decrement for the integer. What I'm doing on that end is to lessen the amount of repetitive strikes to prevent the player from doing repeated combos to increase the combo rank meter, and forcing the player to basically try something different. That's the whole point in character action games like Devil May Cry. Though it's not always the case. Let's see. There we go. Alright, now that I've set up the melee trace for the player, let's move on in setting the hit trace for the enemy. First off, I'm gonna go to third person, go to character, and select enemy. What I'm going to do right here is basically the same thing for the player, in which I'm going to add a hit trace. The hit actor should be the player character. Speaking of which, I'm gonna go to player character and copy this. This whole thing, excluding the add style. Well, yeah, these excluding add style and add burst. Before I do that, the first thing I'm going to do is have the ninja character contain the amount of arrays, then promote to a variable. I'll call it players. Next, I'm going to get is invincible. Use or boolean. Bring out branch. What I did is I connect the false branch to modify hit data, where I have the rest of this whole node, in which I'm going to connect. For the get hit through character, I'm going to extract a node from as player character and connect that node to the target. I'm gonna do the same as I did with the player character. With the location, normal, and hit bones. right here because the enemy isn't using either of these. Add a unique, same as I did with the player character. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to add start. Make sure that the component I'm using is valid. Clear this. Highlight this. Rename it Enemy Melee Trace. This one, I'll do the same. Except I'm starting to trace. What I'm going to do next is set up a trace for enemy AI as I did with the player. And so far I only have 7 of the enemy attacks, which won't be that long, hopefully. The logic here is the same as I did with the player character, in which I have to name the socket for every single melee trace for each attack. And I'm using the skeleton tree for references. go. Alright, I got everything set up. Now, let's see if it works. Yep, it's working. Works like a charm. Now that I set up a melee trace for both player and enemy, I'm going to do the same thing with the current melee weapon equipped for the player character. First and foremost, I'm going to bring back the melee weapon visibility. Then, as you can see from here, it's a little too congested with the way I built this. So, what I'm gonna do is highlight these and convert them to a function. This function should be a pure function. I'm going to rename this function Get Master Melee Weapon. Then open this new function. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of it because it's considered a hard object reference. What I'm going to do instead is use a soft object reference. So I'm going to add a new variable and call it local master melee weapon. Then I'm going to type master melee weapon and use soft class reference. Oops, wrong one. There. Now that I have that, I'm going to use master melee weapon. I'm getting master melee weapon, then I'm going to low class asset blocking. I'm going to cast to master melee weapon class, convert it to pure cast, then I'm going to get actor of class, together. And got myself this. Once I make a few changes here, it's going to have the same thing as I have originally with this hard reference. Let's see. The next thing I'm going to do is set up the hit data for the master melee weapon. To do that, I'm gonna go to master melee weapon, which I already am now. Then I'm going to add a variable. I'm gonna call this hit data. Duplicated. Also, I'll just I'm not gonna bother adding this because I already know what to hit. So I'm going to instead use this to determine whether or not the player character is wielding the melee weapon. Does wield the melee weapon, I'm going to apply the same logic as I have here with the unarmed combat. Bring out this node, type in get hit data, bring it out again, type in modified hit data. logic. To bring out a node, a Boolean node to be precise, and use select. Just to be clear on what I did, if I'm using the melee weapon, the logic from modify hit data should fire up the hit data from the get hit via character. But if I'm not using the melee weapon, the modified hit data within character blueprint, or in this case ninja character blueprint, will fire up the hit data from get hit via character. That being said, I'm gonna organize it. I'm gonna replace that with this. Pretty much it. Now I'm going to add new am notified for the players. More specifically, the am notified state. I'm gonna name this player melee trace. Then I'm going to reparent the blueprint and reparent it as set hitbox. I'm going to click receive notify begin. I'm gonna open the hitboxes and I'm going to do the same thing as I did with the set hitbox. Only this time, I'm gonna have to determine whether or not the player character is using the melee weapon. Before I fire up the melee weapon trace, it's important that I search for this katana, open it, and add only 2 trace sockets. This one should be the bottom blade. grenade. Now that I've added 2 sockets, I'm going to get started with the whole process. Starting with this combo attack. I'm gonna have to give him a weapon in order to know about what trace I'm using. I'll add player melee trace. Adjust the notify state. Place a check mark on it. See if it works. Yep, it works. But I don't need a line trace, I need a box trace. See if I had to have it. Copy this. see if this works. Yep, it does work. If I turn it off. I'm gonna have to change from the hit impact to the slash because the slash particle is the most appropriate for a melee weapon. Test it out again. Oh, before I do that, I have to put it back. Now let's test it out again. Another thing is I'm going to use a select again in order to fix the confusion with the hit sound. see if it works. In order to prevent this confusion, I'm going to go to perform delay combo again. I'm going to use Get Master Melee Weapon. Get Select. I'm going to get Melee Weapon Data. Could work. Then again, I'm going to copy this and paste here. Go. Now that I have that, I'm going to delete this and use some more efficient one in which I created. Let's see. Yep. There we go. Okay, let's test out everything I have so far. First things first, I'm gonna turn off the melee weapon. it out. That's it for the unarmed. Now we'll test with an armed weapon. There we go. Now that is how I set up a damage, well, correction. That is how I improve the damage system in unarmed combat for both the player and enemy, as well as setting the damage system for the equipped melee weapon for the player character. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel for future tutorials regarding this, and as always, what you take and learn from me is yours to do with as you see fit. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your day.